the potential was breathtaking. So I had this mishmash of electronic music coming from the pounding all-night techno that I sometimes try and sleep through or whatever, mixing with the noise music I was listening to, and it was all kind of mashing together at that point. We'd gotten to this point where I think it really refined this unrefinedness, if that makes sense, where it was as anarchic as we could get it without just completely falling apart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 1 of Fatal Strategies, a podcast about, well, making music in the digital age, but that is a pretty broad description. So I should probably say a little bit more by way of introduction about what this podcast is really going to be about. But I'll do that by first introducing our guest, and that is Skye Klein from, well, the Melbourne area of Australia. He's not exactly in Melbourne, but that's sort of where he came of age musically. First with the group Halo in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. I first came across Skye Klein through Halo when I was way into Relapse Records, and Halo, through a sort of a twist of fate that we hear about in this episode, wound up on Relapse for a couple of albums. And as we'll hear, they had some pretty interesting, if abbreviated, touring adventures in the United States and then eventually in Europe before calling it quits. Kind of lost track of him and his music for a little while until 2006, 2007, when I came across an album by Terminal Sound System, which it turns out he had been developing all those years, even while he was doing Halo. But I came across a CD called Compressor on Extreme, the Extreme label out of Australia, maybe most notorious for putting out the Mertz box, 50 CD box set. But again, I sort of lost track of him again for some time. And then through the magic of Bandcamp several years ago, thought maybe I'll check on this Terminal Sound System, and saw that he's still making music. He is up to probably about 10 albums as Terminal Sound System, and then in addition to that, there is A Beautiful Machine, another one of his musical outfits, which I hesitate to even put a genre tag on, but I guess it's kind of in the space rock / shoegaze kind of zone. We don't talk a lot about A Beautiful Machine, but there is one little connection there. I mentioned something that I had read in an interview, and I'll link to this interview, but the gist of it was Skye, in that interview, had recounted an exchange he had, I guess you could say a long-term correspondence with some listeners in Russia, and I thought that was interesting both for the specifics of it, but also sort of as an illustration of some of the ways in which music and the way it is consumed and experienced have changed. There is more that I could say, but this intro has already gone on long enough. So show notes will have links to the various interviews that I refer to. I kind of work off of other people's interviews a lot of times and asking questions or coming up with questions to ask. So those are in the show notes, along with links to all the little musical snippets. All those snippets are from Terminal Sound System, and all that stuff is available on Bandcamp. And I think that pretty much covers it, so let's just go ahead and get into the episode, my interview with Skye Klein. Did you feel like you were coming out of metal, or did you relate to that?
Not as such. So, by that point, Halo had become like Halo was, which was two people, myself and Robert. Robert came from not an entirely metal background, but he played grindcore, and his favorite band was Slayer. But he also played in a bunch. He was maybe 8 years older than me, so there's a bunch of underground Melbourne bands in the 80s that were more psychedelic and experimental stuff. So he was kind of part of that scene as well. I never listened to metal. I had one Iron Maiden record when I was about 14. I never went through that heavy metal upbringing. The closest I got to it was one of my good friends in high school was heavily into Metallica, early Metallica. So he would This was in my last year, so year 12 for our senior year for you guys. So I would have been 17. He was heavily into that, and I was not. But and that same year, I completely randomly discovered Neurosis. Actually, I can't remember what I said in that interview, but I was in the United States visiting because I'm originally from there, visiting family. I was 17. My mum let me go off by myself in Seattle, down by the big market there. I can't remember what it's called. Pike Place Market or whatever.
Okay.
And I found like a little record store, which was, back then quite common, not so much common around here. Little independent record store. And I found that cassette of Souls at Zero, and I bought it because I liked the cover. I'd never heard of them before. We didn't even have the internet at home at the time, so I knew nothing about these bands. I bought it because I liked the record cover. So that was really apart from that one I made, and some AC/DC, that kind of hard rock stuff when I was a younger adolescent. That was my entrance into heavy music. So I did not come up through listening to classic heavy metal or anything like that.
Okay.
So I guess that's the background to that. To answer your question, I would say probably no. Probably no.
Yeah, I didn't come from. I didn't get into like heavy music until late 90s, and I came at it from the experimental side. But it was that real slice of time where like Halo was happening that I was way into Relapse Records. Like say 2000, 2001, 2002 was really the peak of it. But were you following that label pretty closely at the time, or was it mostly just the fact that they had Neurosis and a couple of other things?
Yeah, it was mostly. I mean, I wasn't buying. I wasn't listening to death metal or grind or I was at that point. So we're talking now late 90s. So 98, 99. So we'd recorded and released some stuff, on CDR and stuff. I was running a mail order label and playing gigs around town to 4 people.
Yeah.
And I wasn't the only. I only knew of Relapse because of Neurosis. So I would buy, I would order it, and whenever I'd hear, by that point, had the internet. Whenever I'd hear that a record was coming out, I'd go and order it, and it would take 6 weeks to get here because it would cost me $35, and take 6 weeks to get here from the States. And they were all imports. At that time, there were a couple of really good record stores in Melbourne. But no, apart from that, that's the only I only knew about Relapse because of Neurosis. I was listening to, at the time, then I'd moved into kind of KK Null and a lot of noise guitar stuff. Still a little bit of Godflesh, but my kind of Godflesh period, contrary to popular belief, lasted about a year at the most.
Okay, yeah.
And then I kind of trickled off into other stuff. Relapse was me going, well, let's randomly send a random demo. I didn't even know whether they're big or small. Before you actually meet a record label, they seem like these mythical things. There's silver ivory tower off in a far land. So we just sent them a CD and didn't hear back for about 3 years, I think.
Oh, okay. And it was like
the story goes. Yeah, there's a story. I've since made friends with online friends with Dean, who was an intern there at the time. I think he was working in the mail order section, because they did a lot of mail order still then. Big warehouse at the back, and they had a big box of demos. And the mail had come in, they just toss it into the box and just pile. I later saw the box years later when we went there on tour, and they would occasionally someone would pull something out. I stick this on, whatever, and it might last 2 minutes on the office stereo, and they'd toss it. And out of this lucky dip, he somehow pulled our CD out, which I'd gone to great lengths to make look as we used to make our own CDs. So I'd be out in the garage, and I'd spray painted the covers matte black and screen printed the covers. I'd try and make things special, coming from that DIY background of making tapes and stuff. And it came out, and they put it on, and I got an email from Matt at Relapse, who was the CEO or whatever, the founder.
Right.
And I thought it was a joke at the time.
Okay. Yes, I hadn't realized that I didn't know anything about that tour, and I don't know if that. I don't think that tour ever made the West Coast.
No, it was they. shortly, so they put that record out, and then I'm trying to get my timeline in order. I believe they then put out so that one we'd already released ourselves on mail order, and then they reissued it properly, and then they put out the next one. And I can't exactly remember my timeline, but around that time, so it would have been 2002, I think, I got an email from Ted Parsons, who was then drummer for Godflesh, saying, "Hey, do you want to come on tour in the United States?" And I, again, thought it was a complete joke. Someone's bullshitting me, but it came to be that it was actually Ted Parsons from Godflesh. So I referred him back to the Relapse guys, because I'm like, the closest I've gone is an 8-hour drive to the neighboring state, right, to play music. I mean, for three nights or something. So we'd never been on tour properly before. And so they sorted it out, and they determined that we were a bit too green to be opening for to be the main support for Godflesh. So they got Mastodon on the tour, who were at the time, pretty much living in a van, touring, right, 9 months of the year kind of thing, playing nowhere bars.
Right.
Yeah. That was eye-opening.
Yeah. But yeah, I feel like if like Relapse type bands were on tour, I would schlep out there to there was a metal club that I would often go out to make a trek out there to go see these bands and these big package tours, which it sounds like the one you all were. It wasn't like one of these with like 4 death metal bands where you got to, those would often be pretty tough. Cause I would usually, if I was seeing that, I'd only maybe want to see one of them. And then you got to.
Yeah, it was a weird tour because there was lots of bars and, and again, we were completely green. So we went out there and then suddenly we're playing every night for whatever it was, 3.5 weeks or something. So everywhere from little like dive bars with like 40 people, quite confronting because, there'd be no PA, there'd just be, we used all Mastodon's gear, used their amps. To like, yes, there was some, we kind of got on a few like, 1 or 2 day festivals or something with like the one with, Manowar playing in, where was it? It was like on the some convention center on the foreshore in New Jersey. Random, right? And it's just, but it was one of those kind of all weekend ones where they'd have everyone from Manowar to us to other nobody bands to kind of mid-range bands like Mastodon at the time. But yeah, like 16 hours of death metal. It's like shit. This is just insane. Pretty crazy.
I mean, they really had with, I think one thing that the metal labels and festivals and stuff, they would have really good organization and just audiences. Although I couldn't imagine like what it'd be like to play or find yourself on one of those festivals and not really, again, kind of not necessarily being a metal band per se, but so I didn't realize that you all, before I read that interview, that you all were going to be opening or on that tour with Godflesh, and then it didn't happen. But I did. I can't say I know him, but I interviewed Justin Broderick in 2003. But anyway, he told me that he had kind of a Brian Wilson situation, is how he described it. And so I don't know, was that a let? Obviously, that would have been a bit of a letdown, or.
It was a bit of so we were we got because when we went on this tour, Relapse said, well, these guys need to, they never toured before, so we need to get get them going before this, because the Godflesh run was meant to be a long tour. I think it was like 2 months or something, right around the States. It was a full US tour. They first sent us on this 3-week tour down the East Coast. I think we started in Philly where Relapse was and went. Anyway, it was just East Coast tour. I can't even remember it. And that went for 2 weeks, something 2.5 weeks. We played the last show of that, by which point I was completely physically ruined. I was, sick. We'd never toured before. And it's hard, there's long drives and it was cold and I just screamed my lungs out for 2 weeks straight. So I was a wreck. I was a nervous wreck and a physical wreck. And we were sitting on the porch at Rich Hoke, who is the drummer for Brutal Truth, among other things. He used to tour manage for Relapse. We were sitting on the porch in his house in Philly, West Philly, drinking beer, going, oh my God, we've just finished this thing and now we're about to go on this 2-month odyssey how are we actually going to do this? I was having a bit of a nervous break, Brian Wilson moment myself. And we got the call like right then from, I think Relapse called Rich and said, Justin's called us and called off the tour. He's not coming. He's broken the band up. And I had a simultaneous high and low moment because on one point, obviously, it was a big disappointment because this was for a nobody essentially experimental, whatever, metal band from Australia to be offered this chance was a pretty once in a lifetime thing. But at the same time, I was ruined and I had no idea how I was actually going to do it. At this point, I'd called my then girlfriend back in Melbourne going, I think I'm going to die. This is going to kill me. Every day I'm just getting pummeled by just the exhaustion and anyway, I was having a bit of a moment. So it was a weird thing. We didn't know what to think. And then this went on for a couple of days and there were frantic phone calls because all of this had been teed up. And it turns out they replaced Godflesh with High on Fire.
Okay.
We pulled out for various reasons, partly because I was completely exhausted, partly because the whole thing that got us over there was the Godflesh thing. Right. We thought we'd be playing to people who would give us half a chance. Whereas we just saw that even, High on Fire and stuff are not, death metal bands or, but we just thought we'd be playing to deaf ears for a large point and really exhausting ourselves for no real gain. That sounds like a really Machiavellian way to put it. It's probably not the way we thought of it at the time, but it just didn't seem like something we could do at the time. So we everyone swapped and they swapped us out for, I think, Bongzilla continued on the tour.
Okay.
Such a good name. So I got to say, we had a really good time as well as being completely exhausted and somewhat shell-shocked by that thing. It was a weird time, cultural differences, musical differences. That saying, everyone was really nice and we had a great time. When that happened, Rich, who completely understood, did this whirlwind, thing and booked us about 6 shows in like upstate New York and not rural, but, regional Pennsylvania, in these little like youth centers and stuff. And those were the best gigs I've ever played in my life. He's like, well, if you're going to go home, might as well play a few more shows. And they were, they'd set up in a youth center in some, small town, probably like where I live in now. And everyone would turn up. So there'd be 150 kids there. Kids, I say, anyway, everyone from the age of 14 to probably 34.
Yeah.
And they went off and we went off and we put everything into it. We were playing with no mic stands. And so I was like, this is when I found my thing, which I then went on with in Europe, of playing without a mic stand to make it as difficult and visceral as possible.
I can't picture that. Where did you have the microphone? Like on the floor?
I had it in my hand while I was playing. Because, it's pretty, by that point, it was pretty, the good thing about that tour, because it was so exhausting and so physically grueling, that it really refined the way that we played live, where it got more and more physical and less worried about actually playing notes. I could put it that way. It became like a physical act of like manipulating the guitar or the bass, manipulating it and kind of, sometimes I'd be shrieking into the microphone and hitting, like playing the bass with the microphone, so you'd get the scraping sound as well as the actual notes itself through the PA and through the. So it became this really visceral and violent thing, not towards the audience, but towards ourselves in a sense. And it really refined that, and it really captured what I think was the penultimate expression of that band, which we then took to Europe later on and refined it further.
But that was near the end, right? That Europe.
That was the end of the US tour. That was like these extra gigs that Rich tacked on the end to give us basically a few more gigs to play before we went home again, having come all that way. So I think that was about 5 or 6 gigs.
But then near the end of the band didn't continue that much longer. I wasn't again quite sure how that. I gathered that it was the other member moved.
Yeah, so that was 2000. That was 2003, I believe. We're in 2003 in the States. So we came back home, and then shortly after, Robert, the drummer, moved to the UK for work and just lifestyle choices. So I believe his partner started working at a university there, but I think he'd always wanted to move to the UK because he'd send me emails back saying, "Oh, I went and saw The Cure and Morrissey on the weekend," or I took the train to Italy or whatever, plane, whatever, for the weekend to see The Cure. And I'd be deceivingly jealous. These kind of things don't happen in Australia. Cure come here about once every 20 years. So he moved over there, and I flew over there in, I think it was 2005, maybe. So another Relapse organised tour with, was it Pig Destroyer? And so Pig Destroyer came over from the US. It was a local band that the name escapes me, that were kind of equal parts, I don't know, kind of stoner rock and grindcore kind of mixture, which was cool. And we toured through UK and a bit of Scotland. In the English, I don't think it was winter. I think it was autumn, but it was grim.
Yeah,
it was really grim. It was grey and wet and cold. Of course, I got sick again and shriek. That was a lot of it. By this point, we weren't like these deer in the spotlight. We kind of knew what to expect with the grueling drives and all the rest of it. So it was a lot. It was still physically exhausting, but it was a lot better. And then again, Robert had organised a bunch of shows in mainland Europe after that, in the Netherlands and Belgium and France, with some local kind of noise and punk and industrial bands. So we then trained there and played those shows. And that again was fan. It was kind of a mirror of those ones in rural or regional Pennsylvania and New York and stuff, because they were smaller grassroots gigs, set up in weird warehouses and stuff like that, rather than in bars and clubs and stuff. I remember walking around in snow, like bare feet. Very hazy memories, but they were really good. They were really cool. People putting us up in their houses and stuff. It was that European tour thing, which I've since experienced with other stuff, is just the support network is really, really good. It is in the States as well, but it is another level of hospitality in mainland Europe.
I've heard something to that effect from Americans who have gone over there, and so you don't need to. I imagine here. You've got long, big, fast stretches where there's not much.
Yeah, we would. I remember driving. We'd have these, which probably, again, it's a culture. Probably Americans go so what. We drive for 7-8 hours, between shows, which is just exhausting.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, it's much the same here in Australia. We are so spread out. Australia physically, the landmass is roughly the same size as North America or the United States. Anyway, people don't think of it that way, but it's a very large country, and unless you're going to play in really small towns, which people do, you're still going to be driving 8-10 hours between cities. But we'd be doing that every day, and it's just thankfully we had someone to drive us. But it was completely exhausting.
There was something in that interview that I hadn't seen in a reference I hadn't seen in ages, which was mp3.com. But what do you remember about, finding that and kind of, because you mentioned something about getting paid a lot of money for some newsletter or something like that, but the mp3.com days, because they were short-lived, but it was happening there for...
That was, I generally despise the term game changer, but that is one instance where it's very applicable. I don't remember how I came across mp3.com, but it was completely revolutionary. It changed everything. I had the internet by that time, mainly at work. I was, photocopy boy at an office, and I'd go in on the weekends to use the internet there, and spend 6 hours in this office with no one around, just downloading stuff from mp3.com and listening. And I hadn't discovered, or Napster hadn't, that whole music piracy thing the big explosion in 99, 2000 hadn't quite happened yet. So it was around that time, just on the cusp. And I discovered mp3.com somehow, I don't remember. And, had started releasing. I think it actually was a catalyst to me becoming really productive, because suddenly there was, I won't say a point, because I was, I had this burning urge to create music anyway, but it was encouraging. It encouraged that, knowing that people would hear it. My staunch views on the artist lifestyle have changed as I've gotten older, and now I just, having an audience is really, really important. And suddenly I had an audience. I met a few people via that site that I still know, and that speak fondly of those days. And suddenly I was, making music and uploading music and having people listen to it and getting feedback from it. And then, I was pressing or burning CDs and making the artwork, and people could download the music for free, or they could. I think it was $5 flat price per CD, $5 Australian, or was it US? I can't remember. And this is before PayPal and stuff. So they'd send me a check or whatever in the mail, and I'd go and check the post office box once or twice a week, and then package up the CDs and send them. It was this cusp era of early internet where we were still doing a lot of things the old way, like buying things mail order, but with the added benefit of being able to listen to it first and network with these other people running mail order. There was one guy he was in Texas called Multi-instrumentalist Records, who released a bunch of stuff. And we'd do trades where I'd send him out my stuff and he'd send me his stuff, and I'd try and sell it locally or mail order it. It was really cool. It was so exciting to be able to suddenly have this access to so much underground weird stuff that we now take for granted, and in fact sometimes complain about. There's too much out there these days. Suddenly, it seems like such a luxury. Well, seems like such a privileged argument these days to say, "Oh, there's just too much music out there." At the time, it was so eye-opening, and so the potential was breathtaking. And I mentioned, but it still remains that the most, by far, by an order of magnitude, the most money I've ever made from music was that they'd send out, mp3.com would send out their monthly or weekly email newsletter, and they featured my project Terminal Sound System on one of them. And they had a thing at the time, again, before the whole collapse of the .com boom in 2000 or something.
Yeah.
When there was a lot of money being thrown at it, they were paying people. They were paying royalties for when your music got played. When it got streamed, it would go as a point against you or for you, and they would pay you. I don't know how they did the profit share or whatever, but you would actually get checks in the mail from mp3.com. And I got a check in the mail for, I think it was like $2,500 US or something, which I didn't have a job at the time. That was and with exchange rate, that probably worked out to be about $3,500 Australian dollars, which was massive for me. It's probably more money than I'll ever make from Spotify, for example. In fact, not probably. Like categorically, I'll never.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's like the anti-Spotify.
But that would, people would get, so it got to the point where people were like writing bots and scripts to try and game that system, and they shut it down. Whilst MP3 was still running, they stopped doing payouts. Right. Because inevitably people tried to game the system. But I was getting, like, apart from that one check where they featured me, and I was still getting, checks every couple of months for $20 or $30 or something, which it's nothing, but it's more than most people will ever get from Spotify. Like I said, in our game anyway. It is difficult to overstate, or you can't really overstate the significance of, it's possibly, and correct me if I'm wrong, possibly the first time that underground bands, or outsider bands, for want of a better word, could get global airplay. Yeah. Right? From their home studios, or from that was not possible before without sending tapes or whatever to college radio or whatever. And then, even then, it would be this was suddenly potential worldwide exposure to like-minded people. I think that's unprecedented.
first terminal sound system stuff you did was on a 4-track?
Yes, very, very early. It was never released, but very, 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 very. So it would have been, I think, 98 or something.
Okay.
So it happened concurrently with Halo, but I wanted to do other stuff. You know, I wanted to do other stuff on the side. Started hearing electronic music and stuff, and wanted to play with that. And I had a 4-track, which I recorded early stuff on, but the Halo stuff was not recorded on the 4-track, but I still had it. And so I started making stuff with that. And, I had a computer at home. I got my work to buy me a computer. And then probably put very questionable software on it. And played a few kind of hybrid live shows with a 4-track, and Robert from Halo was doing stuff with making noise or something at the time. We weren't sure what we were doing. I knew I wanted to do something. I didn't know what it was. But I discovered dub, and I was heavily into kind of noise music and stuff at the time, and hadn't listened to any kind of metal for ages by that point, apart from Neurosis. So I'd was kind of reaching for something, trying to find something that was the next step or a sideways step or something, just something different. I was we had a warehouse with some friends in a suburb of Melbourne, which at the time was, quite a grimy, fairly traditionally bohemian suburb. Lots of gigs and stuff. And we lived in this warehouse that we'd converted, and we'd put on gigs and parties quite illegally. So we'd have, there'd be a couple of noise bands or whatever would play in the evening, and then would transition into, techno, which would go to about 4 a.m. And I was kind of exposed, I'd do sound for the noise bands with my mixing desk, or I'd play myself. And then DJs and sometimes live people would do this, pounding techno until the sun rose. And we're in a residential area, but at that time, we never had any police turn up or any trouble. People would come and donate $2 at the door and bring their own whatever they were going to consume, and it was a really cool time. And so I had this mishmash of electronic music coming from this pounding all night techno that I'd sometimes try and sleep through or whatever, mixing with the noise music I was listening to, and my own kind of experiments and Halo, and it was all kind of mashing together at that point.
Was there a similar kind of game changer moment with the recording technology where you saw, I can do this stuff now on my own that I couldn't have done before?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I went to university in 96 to 98, and I did a course which was called Media Arts, which is kind of a generic name, but what it actually was essentially a studio art or a fine art, practical arts, whatever. I'm not sure what it's called in the States, but an art course, as if you'd gone to do painting or sculpture, but on new media, so sound and video art, stuff like that. That course doesn't exist anymore. It had been set up by some some avant-garde artists of the previous generation in Melbourne, and they somehow blagged their way into a prestigious public university and got this course set up and funding. So I went from my 4-track at home to suddenly essentially a professional recording studio that I had 24-hour access to. So my mind was blown then. So that's when I went, well, I always knew this was possible because obviously bands are recording in studio, but I've never been in a proper studio before. Suddenly I saw all this stuff. Around the same time, I don't know how I found out, but somehow, probably because I had the internet at the time. Although, I mean, just as an aside, when you would remember the early, mid to late 90s internet was a lot different from these days internet in terms of, for example, finding out about recording technology. Like you say, it's not like I go to YouTube because YouTube didn't exist. And even searching for, I didn't even know what to search for. I wasn't going to search for digital audio workstation because there was not a name for it at the time. It was all it had been around since the 80s, but it was not it wasn't like these days where every musician can record at home.
Right.
It was still very specialist stuff, specialist and enthusiast stuff is probably a better word for it. So I'd found out about it and found out that you could use a computer to multi-track, to record multi-track and to make sounds and stuff, whilst at the same time learning the skills to do so at uni. So we record bands and learn to splice tape. That because it was run by these artists, they gave us a foundation in music concrete and how to cut and loop tape and synthesis and all these things, very technical kind of skills to give us a foundation for art practice. Essentially, like you go to art school and they teach you how to paint properly before you went out and did whatever abstract stuff you were going to do. So at the same time as learning these skills, I had found out about being able to use a computer. We had a computer. We'd have always had computers at home because my dad works with computers and had since before I was born. Probably one of the first tech startups in Australia. Anyway, we always had computers, so I was comfortable with computers, and I managed to kind of cobble together a way to use the computer to make sound. It didn't work very well. Computers would crash all the time when you're trying to push them to do this kind of stuff at the time. It was, again, different days. So when I finished university, I got a bank loan for a princely sum of it. I think it was like $3,000 or something, which was huge for me. Huge. Don't know. I had no idea how I was going to pay it off, and bought like a digital multi-track because my computer just was not good enough. I knew it could do it, but it wouldn't do it. Bought some speakers and a digital multi-track, so I didn't have to use the 4-track with all its inherent issues with A, only having 4 tracks, but B, the noise and hiss and all the rest of it, which ironically at the time were considered something you didn't want, but
right.
The wheels of fashion and so on. But so it was this, that late 90s again of suddenly, whilst becoming aware of the potential of computers, it wasn't until the crossover time was around 2000. So the first terminal sound system thing that was released was recorded in 99 in that warehouse, and it was using a combination of the computer and the digital multi-tracker because I couldn't do it all on the computer because the computer kept crashing. So I used the computer to manipulate sounds and use possibly one of the very early soft synths to synthesize the sound and stuff, and then record them onto the multi-tracker. And it was a very laborious process, but for me it was just like this world of potential.
Right.
And then I kind of worked that way for a number of years into the early 2000s until early mid 2000s even, until I was comfortable enough using the computer for everything. And then I kind of transitioned over to that.
You weren't an insider electronic music person in the sense of it. Yeah.
Much like Halo and heavy music in general, like Terminal was like I'd heard this music. So people had played me Massive Attack, for example. So around late 90s when Mezzanine came out. And I'd heard, a few years prior, the community radio stations here, playing techno at 3 a.m. We'd be up, partying or whatever. And so I was kind of exposed to it a lot like that. I never went to, I have, but I didn't go to parties and raves and stuff. There was nothing I was interested in apart from the ones that we put on to pay the rent. So it wasn't outside influence. It was like I'd hear Massive Attack and go, oh, I like that. I like how they've got guitars in there as well as the breakbeats and stuff. Or hearing this techno and really appreciating the minimalism, like really hard late night techno, mesmerizing stuff, and like getting bits of it that I liked and then bits that I didn't like. So it's kind of picking and choosing and a bit of an electronic music dilettante at the time, and like taking influence from it and thinking I can use this in a way to further my own expression, use it as a tool, use it as a platform, but never was part of that scene. I never DJ'd, I never made music for the dance floor specifically. So it was interesting. I sense when, I've been to a few techno parties and raves and stuff and really just didn't like it at all. It's not my thing.
Yeah, but it was sort of like a different sonic palette or something that you kind of could use as a launching pad for. That's not the right launch pad, or a foundation, or maybe not foundation, but
it's a path. Yeah, it's a path. It's like I once heard one of my big influences in the very early days. I discovered Scorn. So Mick Harris project from Napalm Death, who then he once said in an interview, he started Scorn, this kind of heavy industrial dub thing, because he wanted to get heavier than Napalm Death. He wanted to try something that was heavier than grindcore and this kind of stuff. And he wanted to get deeper and heavier. And I think that really resonated with me. It was like, I didn't feel I could take, as much as I enjoyed doing it, I couldn't get any further with Halo. Like, we'd gotten to this point where I think it really refined this unrefinedness, if that makes sense, where it was as anarchic as we could get it without just completely falling apart, which it kind of like the very last Halo show did basically completely fall apart. I can send you a photo of the wreckage of bass guitar in several pieces and all the rest of it. We were too poor to be habitual instrument smashers. We don't go in for that kind of thing. But this was the very last show ever, and it just, everything was disintegrated. But we didn't feel like we could, I didn't feel like we could push it any further. And also, Robert was by that point living overseas, so we couldn't play together without me traveling, and we couldn't do it remotely. It just wasn't going to work. It was always a collaborative in the room thing. So I wanted to do something that I could do myself without relying on other people. At the time, I was playing in some other people's bands and stuff. But where am I going with this? Electronic music gave me a way to push what we've been doing with Halo into new realms, or just to further explore that kind of intensity, to try and get something that was that all-encompassing and all-enveloping. That was at least what I was going for. That was a complete world rather than just a song or something.
Saw a more recent interview about A Beautiful Machine, and you mentioned, getting a letter from someone, and I can't remember if they were in Japan or somewhere else, but it kind of connected with this idea of, that we have this connectivity where I can lie on my couch and have this connection to somebody in the UK and somebody in Australia and maybe somebody in Hungary. And it's just a different kind of, you're connecting in one sense, but then we're all kind of isolated in this other sense. And again, I don't know where I'm going with that, but
I think I can.
if you pick it up and just save me, this is.
I'm going to take a leap at that. Where you're going with that, or what is possibly an overarching. So what I see is an overarching theme. So with myself and other people who, some of the people are probably 8-10 years older than me, but roughly of the same generation. I'm just going to put it out there. It's a generation of musicians or artists who have learnt their craft early on. So started making music right before a pretty massive social or technological change. And then rather than staying put playing, in a rock band, have taken advantage of that social and technological change to further their practice, not shied away from it, and not kind of going, I can't go there, it's too scary. I still speak with people who say, I can't use a computer for music. I just can't use computers, which is fine, but I can and I do. And it changed everything for people like me, and I suspect, a lot of people of our generation who make music and consume music as well. So it is this generation of people who started making music right before that happened, or maybe 10 years before that happened, and then have ridden that wave. Not necessarily a wave of popularity in my case, but it's a wave of potential. It is really a wave of technological and social potential, but mainly technological potential to suddenly for our music to reach other people, and on the flip side, for other people to be able to enjoy or connect with this music from that they would otherwise just literally not have access to. You mentioned the letter. I mean, I can touch on that briefly. It was an email from I won't go into it deeply, but it was from Russia, from a couple of people, through some back and forth. So I don't know anything about Russia, apart from having something of fascination with when I was in primary school, because they were the Russians, right? People of our generation get that. Being at the tail end of the Cold War, in early schooling, I remember the first time seeing the Russians at the 1984 Olympic Games on television.
Right.
Oh wow! So they're not necessarily like these robots that are carrying assault rifles.
But then you also had Rocky.
Yeah,
Rocky where he kills we have
the kids of the 1980s generation, born in the mid 70s or whatever, growing up in the 1980s. There's a weird view of the Eastern Europe in general, but anyway, some people that have come to be very close friends, and kind of opened me up to there's these pockets of people, literally on the other side of the world, that I have reached, and that have not only listened to the music, but it opened up about. It kind of sounds really corny, but how it has helped them, or how it has gotten through really hard times, which is a direct result of that. I mean, what are the chances of? And this was specifically with A Beautiful Machine, which it's never been released on a proper label before. So without the internet and without these technological advances, it wouldn't have got there, probably. I don't see how it would have found its way to these people. But that actually sparked the resumption, I guess, the word, me resuming that project after 17 years or something. I was getting this out of the blue, a couple of emails, and the realization that it's actually at this point, and this is not specific to what we're talking about, at this point, some of these things actually mean possibly more to others than it even does to me. Or it has a new life somewhere else, a life that is beyond my control,
right,
to some extent. And that, I guess, the relevance to what we're talking about is just, again, the connectivity offered by this revolution. And it's a shit, or it's a pretty hackneyed term, but it really was a revolution of communication. And
it's the opposite of the immediate feedback that one would get from playing in front of an audience. It's more like sending a message in a bottle, and then somebody gets that message and then sends it back, and I can only imagine, you work on an album and then you put it out, and you're kind of like, well, look, maybe seeing, what is the reaction going to be, and then how meaningful it could be. Yeah, when somebody does reach out. Not to say again that that's like necessarily because you were doing other music in the meantime, and you're not sitting there saying, I'm not going to make any other music until somebody tells me that they like it. But at the same time, I can imagine, it takes a lot of motivation, will to do this, and particularly because it seems like you're pretty much a one man operation in most of these bands or outfits projects. And again, that's another thing that I admire, because it takes a certain something to see these things through. And then again, you're not necessarily getting that immediate feedback. You're not getting it from bandmates. I wonder what that's like, as far as Yeah,
Yeah,
like it's like operating in that way.
it is very the message in the bottles. That's a very good analogy, I think, because you have no idea where it's going, and you have no idea whether it's going to come back. There's good chance it's probably not going to come back at all, and that it's isolating. It's nice being in a band when it works is really nice. You know, it's like-minded people making stuff, having that direct feedback. It's been a long time since it's difficult difficult to say, but I remember it being really nice. It's quite isolating. I think you've got to be really. It really shines a light on why you are doing this, like why you're actually doing this. If it is for immediate gratification of ego gratification or whatever, and likes, and you're probably going to stop doing it pretty quickly. Like it's nothing that I release gets a lot of immediate attention, and the attention it does get is pretty spaced out and scattered and pretty niche. So not doing it for money and not doing it for immediate gratification. So why are you doing this? So it is possibly the biggest cliche, but if you're not doing it for love, then you're kind of fooling yourself, really. It's and fun. I mean, fun's cool too. It's got to be fun, isn't it? It's I don't know where else to go with that.
Maybe to bring it back to Terminal Sound System, it's something that has taken on a life of its own, maybe different from what you initially saw it as, because I don't know exactly I haven't probed the maybe what references there might be in the artwork or song titles, but in terms of themes, but I gathered that there was some sort of continuity, and I don't know if you could say more about, has that emerged over the course of the last 20 years, that there is a sort of theme?
Absolutely, yeah. Especially the last. So the first couple of albums in the 90s and very early 2000s, one of which is completely lost, didn't really have any themes. That was me finding my way. And then the next ones, which is the ones on Extreme, again, wasn't a lot of. I think I was looking for something. I was looking for something, and I didn't know what it was. I was searching. I think I was searching for themes and stories and ways to tell a story or a narrative without, because at the time there wasn't many. Well, there wasn't a lot of vocals or anything like that in there. And then once I started the records, I started releasing on Denner Valley in Germany. A theme started emerging, and which has then continued through the last few albums. So in a way, that isolation of not working with other people, I think, has actually helped with that developing a narrative, because it's extremely insular and I can just work on it myself, and it turns around in my head, and I start to live with it, and I start to leave it to a certain extent, and it pulls together a whole bunch of really personal memories and childhood stuff. Again, I was thinking about. I went for a walk this morning before I spoke to you. I was thinking about how things feed into this narrative that's been going on for a few albums, and some of my earliest, so my formative memories as a kid in the 80s, apart from the Russians, was listening to Vangelis and other stuff that I don't know what it was, but it was on community radio. That was, again, like kind of ambient space music, probably from the late 70s. And reading Omni magazine. I don't know if you remember that from. So it's an American magazine, predated Wired and stuff like that. Obviously, it just came out in the 90s. Omni magazine was you can find it on archive. It's like this it was like a meeting. It was almost like the extension of like Whole Earth Catalog or something like that from the 60s and 70s.
Okay.
It was like a meeting of what I would call utopianism, or futurism and utopianism mixed with. So they'd have articles about, the potential of the human mind and, how to colonize, whether we're going to colonize space or something. So we're talking, 84, 85 or something. Then they'd have science fiction stories. And then they'd have stories, stories about ESP and meditation and ghosts. And they'd have ads. The ads would be like for telescopes, next to ads for self-improvement tapes, and next to ads for hypnosis tapes. So it was this. There's probably probably someone's written a PhD about it, but there's this combination of spirituality, futurism, and what you call kind of almost, I guess that would fit with the spirit, like new age-ness.
Yeah.
I think then, and it kind of mashed together in my head with with this kind of 70s ambient space music, and it's all very futurist and optimistic and like looking towards a shiny future, which somehow got corrupted at some point. But and it also mixed, for me, it's also a mirror. So it mixed with a bit later on, and I started getting into like reading, as one tends to do in one's teens, reading about the late 60s and Summer of Love, so-called, and this kind of era, this golden era of music and culture in the United States. Yeah. And how it also kind of spiraled into this car crash right before we were born, actually, right? And so we kind of came out of this thing. And I think there was also this utopian futurism of the 1980s, which I think mirrors that fall of the 1960s as the 80s became the 90s and the 2000s. I'm kind of riffing on this at the moment because it's always in my head.
There are connections as far as you mentioned, like the Whole Earth Catalog and Stuart Brand and stuff. There are actual like personal, like the hippies, and people have written books about that as far as the connection between the hippies and the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, well, that whole kind of that continuum. And I had my dad, mail ordering, self-improvement tapes and stuff. You're getting in and that was actually recently a huge. It's something that I've been working on that, and I can't quite nail it down. It's an aesthetic and an aesthetic and a feeling and a concept, and I can't quite nail it down. But it's all of these things mixed together, mixed with a bit of kind of 70s and 80s, so branch. Well, that was 90s, but like cult stuff. So the separatist cults, particularly in the United States, and it's kind of mixed into this narrative in my head. All this stuff from the childhood, and then a friend of mine was heavily into researching Waco and all these pretty horrid stuff that went on over there, and Scientologists and stuff, and it's all kind of mixed together into this thing. This kind of stew of spirituality and science fiction and separatism, in a sense, and inform this kind of narrative that Terminal Sound System went on with, particularly the last 4 albums of a post future, or a near future. And here I'm really scattered trying to think about it, because it's, for me, these things are a feeling. It's almost a taste.
Yeah.
And it's something that I kind of build up in myself and then let it kind of flow. And it's very difficult to articulate it without it sounding either really generic or just doesn't make sense at all.
Well, sometimes, music that I think if some of these things are like pre-verbal, or they don't lend them. That's what music is for, is to express things that don't work, or that can't necessarily be put into words or effectively put into words. But that's interesting though, that futurism, that I think for, if we go back and listen to stuff from the turn of the 80s, and I've been doing a lot of that lately, and I can hear stuff and say, oh, that, even though I've never heard this specific band or song, that's the world I grew up in. And there is almost like an innocence and an optimism to it. And then here we are now, and it's kind of like, well, yeah, there's some great things have happened, but it's never the way that the utopians envision it. And there's a lot of dystopian stuff, and it's like, wow, this is not the future that was being envisioned by the techno utopians 40 years ago.
This is not what we were promised.
Right. Yeah, this is not the flying cars, and
that's it. I mean,
it's that sad, but I get some of that through Terminal Sound System as an example, but I don't want to project on it. But it's like, in a mood sense, it conveys something of living in this whatever it is that we're living in, kind of wrong turn from the future. Because some people will say they're doing quote futuristic. If you say futuristic synth, you can pretty much dial up a tone, and you're not doing that. You're not like dialing up retro futurists. You're doing something that is.
Yeah. There is that trend towards the retro futurism with synthwave and stuff. Some of which I love, because again, we grew up with it. It reminds me of being 15 and going with your $2 to the arcade and playing Spy Hunter or something. Right? Not that anyway. Outrun is the one that's cited as the but so there is that, which no, I'm not doing. The whole vaporwave, so-called vaporwave thing of the maybe 8
years ago.
Which I went through a period of listening to a lot of that on YouTube, because I think it's fabulous. The stuff that's well done is really, really, really good. I really like it. And again, 80s kid, you just have to show me a picture of an abandoned shopping mall, and I'm in heaven, right?
Yeah.
that hits me right in the nostalgia. So that whole thing played into our generation, which is funny because the people making it are probably 20 years younger than us.
Right. Yeah.
So it's interesting. But no, so there is this, without trying to get myself tongue-tied again, trying to pinpoint all these parts of the narrative. There's quite a somewhat traditional science fiction story behind a lot of it, of escaping a place, let's say a planet, colonizing another planet, or let's say another planet. Put it just purely in like it's a science fiction novel, going from a planet to another planet, but these, having read about this kind of thing since I was a kid, this is a multi-generational excursion. You don't just fly to another planet. It probably takes you 200 years to get there. So several generations later, the planet is colonized. And what happens when you have a brand new world and a chance to start over, and no real precedent to go off, and no history, and in this case, obviously, it doesn't end very well. Otherwise, the music would sound completely different. But it's kind of trying to envision this, almost a Wild West, a frontier land in the future, with the treated tape looped acoustic guitars and stuff, and in the more recent stuff, which is what I'm kind of referring to. There's this touchstones in folk music and stuff of being, because you're in a new land, you've got an acoustic guitar and a broken tape deck, or maybe the broken tape deck's a bit of a stretch, but you don't have a synthesizer. It's not a shiny future. It's actually a really dirty, dusty, dark future, just like it was, in the Old West here or there. The city I live in was one of the original gold rush towns here in Australia. So we also have that, that gold rush cowboy history, which has also been a big influence on me. The spaghetti western thing. So it's almost my take on the spaghetti western film set in the future is probably the most prosaic way I can put it. Influenced also by all this, spiritualist and utopian futurist stuff. And it's telling stories in that, creating an environment and telling stories within that environment, like an author would do or a novelist would do, is building a world and then using that world to tell stories, because the characters are there and it's ready to go, and you can just kind of play. It's a playground to play in that world and make stories up, with the recurring themes that happen in stories and all the rest of it. think that's where I can put that.